On February 6, 1952, King George VI died at Sandringham, and his 25-year-old daughter became Queen Elizabeth II. Her first crisis wasn't the Cold War, the Commonwealth, or Winston Churchill. It was the transfer of royal life between Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, after one woman became the sovereign and another became the Queen Mother. The popular version is sharper. It says the Queen Mother refused to leave Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth had to ask twice, and Churchill finally made her go. The surviving record doesn't prove those private scenes. No published letter records Elizabeth asking twice. No direct order from the new queen has been identified. No reliable document establishes that Churchill sent the Queen Mother an ultimatum. But the verified timeline is still extraordinary. George VI died on February 6, 1952. The Queen Mother's final move from Buckingham Palace to Clarence House is best placed in May 1953. A contemporary newspaper report dated May 20th said she had moved yesterday, placing the transfer on May 19th. Elizabeth II's coronation followed on June 2nd, 14 days later. That is 15 months and 13 days from the king's death to the reported move. The story matters because Buckingham Palace wasn't simply a very large home containing spare bedrooms. It was, and remains, the official London residence and administrative headquarters of the monarch. The new queen could work elsewhere. Royal business had never been tied to one desk or one building. Yet Buckingham Palace was where the sovereign's household, audiences, ceremonies, correspondence, receptions, and public identity converged. A widowed queen consort remaining there for more than a year wasn't proof of constitutional chaos. The household continued to function. Elizabeth herself moved from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace during the summer of 1952, and the woman meant to leave Buckingham Palace was reported to detest the house she was being sent to. Buckingham Palace had served as the official London residence of the sovereign since Queen Victoria took up residence there in July 1837. By 1952, it contained staterooms, private apartments, staff quarters, offices, reception spaces, and the infrastructure of a public monarchy. Its 775 rooms included 19 staterooms, 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices, and 78 bathrooms. Those numbers create the obvious objection. Why couldn't Elizabeth II and her mother just live in separate wings? Because the palace didn't operate like a country house divided among relatives. The private secretary's office was based there. So was the privy purse and treasurer's office. The monarch held audiences there with prime ministers, ambassadors, bishops, military officers, and members of the Privy Council. State banquets, investitures, diplomatic receptions, garden parties, and the immense ceremonial calendar of the crown all depended on the building. The royal household wasn't one domestic staff serving an extended family. The sovereign had a household. Other working members of the royal family maintained their own smaller households. The distinction mattered because the people serving the sovereign's constitutional and ceremonial duties weren't there to serve whoever had lived in the palace longest. They served the reigning monarch. In 1952, Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles was Elizabeth II's private secretary. He had held the post under George VI since 1943 and remained with Elizabeth until 1953. The private secretary's job placed him at the main channel between the sovereign and government. He managed official correspondence and the monarch's program. The Lord Chamberlain's office handled major ceremonial and public-facing elements of the sovereign's work. The keeper of the privy purse and treasurer managed the finances of the royal household. None of that means the Queen Mother's continued presence caused a documented breakdown in reporting lines. There is no evidence that Lascelles or the Lord Chamberlain became unable to do their work. The point is subtler. The headquarters belonged institutionally to the reigning sovereign, even though the people within it couldn't instantly rearrange their lives when the sovereign changed. Britain's monarchy often depends on exactly that distinction between law and convention. A convention isn't a statute. It does not appear as a single legal command that a court can enforce in the same way as an act of Parliament. But conventions can still shape the entire operation of government because everyone who matters treats them as binding. The office of Prime Minister itself developed through convention rather than a founding statute. A monarch appoints a government on ministerial advice through convention. The Crown's relationship with Parliament is governed partly by law and partly by habits that have been obeyed for generations. The move expected after George VI's death sat in that world. No source establishes that the Queen Mother automatically lost a legal right to live at Buckingham Palace the instant her husband died. There was no statutory eviction clock. Buckingham Palace wasn't George VI's private property, inherited by his daughter as if it were a family estate. It was held in right of the Crown. Yet the accession created a powerful institutional expectation. The reigning Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh would occupy Buckingham Palace. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret would move to Clarence House. Royal Collection Trust states that Clarence House was prepared for the Queen Mother after Elizabeth's accession. That single word, prepared, tells us much of what was officially intended. Clarence House wasn't selected after a sudden domestic dispute. It was the designated next home for the Queen Mother. The sequence also had precedent. When Edward VII died in 1910, Queen Alexandra moved from Buckingham Palace to Marlborough House, while George V and Queen Mary took over the palace. Queen Mary had seen the tensions of that earlier transition at close range. Alexandra had been slow to give up parts of the old court's status and possessions. She had also demanded precedence over the new queen at Edward VII's funeral. When George V died in 1936, Queen Mary lived at Marlborough House. By February 1952, she was still there, an elderly dowager queen maintaining a separate household from the reigning sovereign. The pattern was clear. A queen consort became a widow. The heir became sovereign. The official London residence shifted to the new monarch. The former queen established a separate court and household elsewhere. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon understood that pattern better than most people alive. She had become queen consort in December 1936 after Edward VIII abdicated. Buckingham Palace had been her home for 16 years. She lived there through her husband's coronation, the Second World War, the Blitz, victory in Europe, austerity, imperial retreat, and George VI's declining health. During the war, Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times. One bomb destroyed the palace chapel while George VI and Queen Elizabeth were inside. Windows were blown out. Staff numbers fell as men joined the armed forces. The King and Queen often spent their nights at Windsor Castle for safety, but worked at Buckingham Palace. When the palace itself was bombed, the Queen famously said she was glad, because it meant she could look the East End in the face. The sentence reflected wartime solidarity. It also reveals how closely Buckingham Palace had become tied to her public role. This wasn't merely the address where she slept, it was the place where she had spent 16 years performing queenship. Then George VI died. The constitutional mechanics were immediate. Elizabeth became queen at the moment of her father's death. Parliament was informed. The Accession Council met at St. James's Palace. The proclamation was read publicly on February 8th. The human arrangements were slower. Elizabeth was in Kenya when George VI died. She and Philip had been staying at Sagana Lodge after a night at Treetops Hotel. Philip told her that her father was dead and that she was now queen. Within days, the royal party returned to Britain. On February 8th, contemporary reporting recorded that Elizabeth and Philip went to Clarence House. They had lived there since their marriage in November 1947. It was their first London home as a married couple. Princess Anne had been born there in August 1950. Their life at Clarence House had been comparatively domestic by royal standards. For the first 3 months of Elizabeth's reign, she remained there in mourning. Then, in the summer of 1952, she moved to Buckingham Palace and began the full routine of sovereign duties. On November 4th, she carried out her first state opening of Parliament. That fact corrects one of the most repeated versions of this story. Elizabeth didn't spend the entire 15 months governing from Clarence House because her mother had physically prevented her from entering Buckingham Palace. The evidence shows that Elizabeth became resident at Buckingham Palace in the summer of 1952. The Queen Mother's final move to Clarence House came later. That makes this less like a lockout and more like an extended, overlapping transfer of households, staff, rooms, possessions, and status. It was still unusual enough to carry institutional meaning. The palace had become Elizabeth II's official London residence. Yet the household of the former queen consort remained there until the spring before the coronation. A palace can hold 2 royal women. It can't sustain 2 equal centers of monarchy. Elizabeth and Philip had their own reasons not to rush toward Buckingham Palace. Later accounts report that they loved Clarence House and didn't want to leave it. Penny Junor's account, quoted in later reporting, describes Churchill as insisting that the new Queen and Philip must move to Buckingham Palace. That is the Churchill intervention we can support. Winston Churchill was Prime Minister when Elizabeth acceded. He had returned to office in October 1951, 4 months before George VI died. He knew the late king from the war years and understood the practical force of royal symbolism. The new sovereign had to be located where the sovereign was expected to be seen. Churchill reportedly pressed Elizabeth and Philip to leave the smaller family house and take up residence at the palace. No available document proves that he sent the Queen Mother a personal instruction in May 1953. No public record gives his words. No source establishes that he threatened her, ordered her out, or personally set the move date. The strongest version of Churchill's role isn't that he evicted the Queen Mother. It's that he pressed the new sovereign to occupy the sovereign's headquarters. That distinction changes the story. It means the pressure in 1952 wasn't simply a daughter trying to remove an obstructive mother. Elizabeth and Philip reportedly preferred Clarence House. The Queen Mother reportedly disliked Clarence House. Churchill favored the institutional arrangement that put the sovereign in Buckingham Palace. The system was moving everyone toward the expected places. The Queen Mother's reluctance was real enough to appear repeatedly in accounts of the period. The exact language requires care. Later descriptions say she called Clarence House small and horrid. That exact phrase has circulated widely, but no dated primary letter identifying the recipient has been produced in the accessible record. House and Garden, citing Tina Brown, reports her characterization of it as a horrid little house. The Guardian described Clarence House as a comparatively small residence she openly detested. The word loathsome appears in several secondary accounts. Vanity Fair reproduces a longer passage, attributed through a source identified as Smith, in which the Queen Mother reportedly complained about criticism of her redecoration costs and wanted it made clear how little had been done to the house and how loathsome it was. The original letter isn't available in the published material. Its date, recipient, and archival reference aren't supplied, so the phrase can't carry the weight of a fully verified personal quotation. But the larger picture is consistent. She didn't want Clarence House. Why not? Part of the answer was physical scale. Clarence House was smaller than Buckingham Palace, closer in character to a grand London townhouse than a ceremonial palace. It had been built in the 1820s for William, Duke of Clarence, who later became William IV. William preferred it to Buckingham Palace. When a fire destroyed the Houses of Parliament in 1834, he even offered Buckingham Palace as a possible replacement for Parliament while he remained at Clarence House. Parliament refused. By 1952, Clarence House had already served Elizabeth and Philip as a young family home. It stood beside St. James's Palace on the Mall. Its location was central, royal, and established. It wasn't an exile. But it was also not Buckingham Palace. The difference wasn't only square footage. Buckingham Palace had the balcony, the staterooms, the guards, the diplomatic audiences, the grand staircases, the route down the Mall, and the visible machinery of monarchy. It was the place where a reigning sovereign appeared to the nation. Clarence House was a place from which a former queen could live with dignity, but it marked a changed role. That changed role had a name: Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The title was created to distinguish the widowed Queen Elizabeth from her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. It preserved royal rank while establishing generational separation. According to reporting on William Shawcross's official biography, the Queen Mother called the title a horrible name in a 1953 letter to Elizabeth II. The title made the constitutional fact impossible to ignore. She had been queen. Her daughter was queen now. Clarence House needed preparation before the Queen Mother moved in. Royal Collection Trust confirms that it was prepared for her. Other accounts describe refurbishment and redecorating. Reported figures for the work are wildly inconsistent. One source cites £10,800. Others use sums approaching or exceeding £1 million without making clear whether they refer to the same work, later valuations, or inflation-adjusted calculations. Those numbers shouldn't be treated as a settled total. The evidence supports a narrower point. The house needed adaptation. Furnishings had to be selected, rooms altered, staff accommodated, and a new household created. The Queen Mother's eventual residence would contain her paintings, porcelain, silver, furniture, and personal possessions. The former Duke of Edinburgh's study became her morning room. Preparation was a genuine factor. What the surviving material does not establish is that building work alone required 15 months. It also does not establish that renovation was a deliberate excuse for refusing to leave. The most responsible reading leaves both possibilities in view. A substantial move had to be organized, and the incoming resident plainly didn't like the destination. Those facts are enough to explain delay without inventing a private argument. Still, by the spring of 1953, delay had acquired a calendar. Elizabeth II's coronation was set for June 2nd at Westminster Abbey. The date wasn't a casual pageant booking. It was the public consecration of the new reign. The ceremony required months of planning across the Abbey, government, armed forces, royal household, Commonwealth delegations, broadcasters, police, dressmakers, and visiting dignitaries. Norman Hartnell designed Elizabeth's coronation gown. Its embroidery carried the floral emblems of the realms and Commonwealth countries connected to her reign: the Tudor rose, Scottish thistle, Welsh leek, Irish shamrock, Australian wattle, Canadian maple leaf, New Zealand silver fern, South African protea, lotus flowers for India and Ceylon, and wheat, cotton, and jute for Pakistan. The broadcast would make the coronation the first British coronation seen on television by millions of people. The Queen had already lived there since the summer of 1952. Her state duties were being carried out, yet the last phase of the Queen Mother's relocation remained unfinished. The record gives us dates, not motive. Royal Collection Trust says the Queen Mother moved to Clarence House shortly before the coronation in 1953. Vanity Fair, drawing on biographies by William Shawcross and Hugo Vickers, places the move in May. A contemporaneous issue of the Singapore Standard, dated May 20th, reported that the Queen Mother had moved from Buckingham Palace the previous day. That gives us May 19, 1953, 14 days before the coronation. One official royal biography uses 1952 as the move year. That conflicts with the contemporary May 1953 report and the Royal Collection Trust's shortly before the coronation wording. The most plausible explanation is that the official biography uses a broad annual chronology, perhaps marking the decision or the intended reassignment, rather than the final physical move. But that remains an explanation, not a proven correction. The safe conclusion is simple. The final settled move happened in May 1953, most likely on May 19th, and accounts don't all preserve the transition with the same precision. Group Captain Peter Townsend reportedly organized the move. Townsend had been an equerry to George VI and remained close to the household after the king's death. His role in the relocation connected the old reign to the new arrangement. He was also becoming central to Princess Margaret's life, a relationship that would develop into a separate royal crisis. For the Queen Mother, the move involved more than trunks and furniture. She had spent 16 years as Queen Consort. Buckingham Palace had formed the public stage of that identity. Her staff, collections, routines, and family life had been arranged around it. Moving meant acknowledging that the palace no longer revolved around her and that it never would again. The Queen Mother did move. Her art collection moved. Princess Margaret moved with her. Her household moved. Clarence House became her London home from 1953 until her death in 2002. Buckingham Palace became unambiguously the Palace of Elizabeth II. The coronation took place on June 2, 1953. Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, conducted the ceremony. Philip paid homage to his wife as Queen. Cameras carries much of the service into homes across Britain, transforming television ownership and royal spectacle at the same time. After the ceremony, the procession returned to Buckingham Palace. The palace's famous balcony became the image the public remembered. Elizabeth and Philip, joined by members of the royal family, above crowds gathered along the Mall. The Queen Mother was present too, smiling alongside the family. Nothing in that public image exposed whatever strain had attended the transition. That was one of the monarchy's great institutional skills. It could absorb a complicated change of role, residence, staff, title, and family hierarchy while presenting continuity to the public. The Queen Mother's move didn't remove her influence. It relocated it. At Clarence House, she built a substantial independent household. One account describes approximately 30 staff, divided between an upper household, handling official work, and domestic employees below stairs. She filled the rooms with objects accumulated over decades: paintings, porcelain, silver, furniture, photographs, and gifts. The house became recognizably hers. The morning room had been Philip's study when Elizabeth and Philip lived there. Under the Queen Mother, it became a room shaped around her routines and taste. Later accounts describe a garden room, created by opening two ground-floor rooms together. Her possessions transformed the building from a house prepared for her into a home controlled by her. That transformation is the real final reversal. The woman, reportedly reluctant to leave Buckingham Palace, spent nearly half a century at Clarence House. She didn't become constitutionally irrelevant because she had moved. She remained a public figure with patronages, honorary roles, staff, social authority, and immense popular affection. Commentators have later described her household and social world as a court within a court. That phrase shouldn't be mistaken for a constitutional description. The Queen Mother couldn't appoint ministers, receive formal constitutional advice, grant royal assent, or open parliament in her own right. Those powers belonged to Elizabeth II, but informal power isn't imaginary because it's informal. The Queen Mother had long experience, personal loyalty from staff, public affection built during the war, and a place at the emotional center of the royal family. Clarence House gave those assets an address. It became a secondary royal center of gravity, close to Buckingham Palace, but distinct from it. Elizabeth's reign and her mother's public life, therefore, ran alongside one another for almost 50 years. The 1952-53 transition didn't end with one woman crushed and another victorious. It created two separate courts, two staffs, two identities, and two places within the same royal system. Buckingham Palace belonged to the sovereign. Clarence House became the Queen Mother's domain. The story is often framed as proof that Elizabeth II was too passive with her mother. The evidence can't carry that judgment cleanly. No source in the available record establishes that Elizabeth asked twice for the palace. No source identifies a meeting in which she demanded that her mother leave. No private diary entry tells us whether she was frustrated, intimidated, patient, grief-stricken, or simply willing to let the household transition take its course. No direct order has been made public. That absence is significant only in a limited way. It tells us that the archival record available to the public does not provide a visible command. It does not prove that no private conversation, instruction, or arrangement occurred. Silence in royal history is often just that, silence. The same limit applies to Churchill. He appears in later accounts as the prime minister who pressed Elizabeth and Philip to move to Buckingham Palace. That fits the institutional logic of the situation. The sovereign had to be visibly installed at the official London residence and headquarters of the monarchy. But no surviving source in the available material gives us Churchill's supposed May 1953 message to the Queen Mother. We don't know whether he wrote, spoke through an intermediary, or did nothing directly at all. We can't responsibly put words in his mouth. The high-drama version imagines Churchill ending a family siege. The evidence supports something quieter. Churchill favored the correct constitutional arrangement. Elizabeth and Philip moved to Buckingham Palace in 1952, and the Queen Mother's final transfer to Clarence House was completed in the 2 weeks before the coronation. That is enough to make the timing meaningful. It isn't enough to prove direct coercion. The phrase, refused to leave, needs the same calibration. The Queen Mother remained at Buckingham Palace for about 15 months after her husband's death. She was reported to have disliked Clarence House intensely. The house was being prepared for her. The final move took place shortly before Elizabeth's coronation. Those facts support reluctance. They don't give us an explicit recorded refusal. A woman can resist an outcome without making a speech, writing a declaration, or defying a formal order. Delay itself can become a form of resistance. But that is an interpretation, not a document. The interpretation gains force because this wasn't a neutral relocation. Clarence House represented the Queen Mother's new position. Buckingham Palace represented the position she had lost. The moment George VI died, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was no longer queen consort. Her daughter was sovereign. No amount of public affection could alter that constitutional fact, yet public affection mattered. The Queen Mother had been one of the most beloved figures in Britain during the Second World War. She and George VI stayed in London while bombs fell. She visited hospitals, factories, and bomb-damaged neighborhoods. Her wartime appearances became part of the monarchy's claim to share national hardship. The public remembered that history. A younger queen confronting such a mother wasn't confronting an ordinary family member. She was confronting the widow of a wartime king, a woman with enormous symbolic authority, a lifetime of royal experience, and a public image that had become almost inseparable from national endurance. Elizabeth II's choice to avoid public conflict was therefore understandable, even if we can't prove it was a conscious tactic. The monarchy couldn't afford an obvious fight between the new sovereign and the grieving widow of George VI. A public rupture would have turned a household transfer into a national spectacle at the beginning of a reign. Instead, the transition occurred behind closed gates. The Queen Mother's eventual life at Clarence House shows why the move was never about stripping her of dignity. She received a major royal residence, a substantial household, continued public work, and the ability to create a separate world around herself. In 1953, she also bought the Castle of May on the Caithness coast in northern Scotland. The purchase does not prove why she delayed the Clarence House move. It does, however, show the Queen Mother's continuing determination to build a life beyond the palace. Castle of May became another place shaped around her preferences, routines, staff, and private identity. The former queen consort had lost the palace as her principal home, but she didn't surrender the ability to create homes of her own. That pattern matters because it brings us back to the central question. Was the 1952-53 episode a constitutional showdown? Not in the hard legal sense. There was no documented statutory eviction. There is no proof that Elizabeth issued a formal command and the Queen Mother defied it. There is no evidence that the royal household collapsed into competing chains of authority. Was it merely a routine house move after a bereavement? That is too soft. Buckingham Palace was the administrative headquarters of the monarch. Clarence House had been prepared for the Queen Mother. The expected transfer took roughly 15 months to complete. The Queen Mother's reported distaste for Clarence House was strong and persistent. The final move happened only 14 days before the coronation placed Elizabeth II before the world as the crowned sovereign. The evidence points to a prolonged negotiation between institutional expectation and personal attachment. Grief was real. Logistics were real. Refurbishment was real. Status was real too. One didn't cancel out the others. The Queen Mother had been 51 when George VI died. She had not been a frail, elderly widow withdrawing from public life. She had decades ahead of her. She would live another 50 years, die at 101, and remain one of the most visible figures in British public life. A move to Clarence House wasn't simply about where she would live next month. It was about how she would live for the rest of her life. The palace was the public theater of the role she had inhabited since 1936. Clarence House would be the headquarters of the role she now had to invent. She eventually invented it very successfully. The Queen Mother's social world, staff, patronages, and ceremonial presence ensured that she remained a major royal figure until the 21st century. Her household had no constitutional authority, but it had influence rooted in proximity to the Queen, long-standing personal loyalty, and public goodwill. Elizabeth II, meanwhile, mastered a different kind of authority. She became the sovereign who received prime ministers, opened parliament, chaired audiences, made state visits, and carried the crown through decolonization, political crisis, family scandal, and 70 years of changing public expectations. Their relationship survived the transition. That survival may be the most revealing outcome of all. The public record shows no explosive break, no leaked ultimatum, no declaration from Buckingham Palace, no visible act of humiliation. The Queen Mother moved, the new queen was crowned, the family appeared together on the balcony. The institution had achieved its preferred result, continuity without a public record of conflict. That does not mean there was no conflict. It means the record can't prove its private shape. Elizabeth II's reign was often defined by restraint. Her public language was cautious. Her political role depended on discretion. Her private views were rarely disclosed. The 1952-53 residence transition fits that larger style, though it can't be used as proof of a deliberate personal doctrine. A young queen didn't publicly rebuke her mother. A formidable former queen didn't publicly challenge her daughter. The household reached the arrangement convention expected. Churchill reportedly pressed the sovereign toward the palace. The coronation gave the calendar an immovable date. By May 1953, most likely May 19th, the Queen Mother had moved to Clarence House. 14 days later, on June 2nd, Elizabeth II was crowned. The title claim that Elizabeth had to ask twice remains unverified. It may preserve a truth about the emotional atmosphere of the story, but it can't be presented as a documented event. The claim that Churchill personally forced the Queen Mother out is also unproven. The evidence places Churchill more securely at the beginning of the process, insisting that Elizabeth and Philip move into Buckingham Palace. The stronger, stranger story is this. For about 15 months after George VI's death, the former Queen Consort remained at Buckingham Palace, while the new sovereign's household completed the transition into its proper headquarters. The Queen Mother was reported to loathe the residence assigned to her. The Queen and Philip had reportedly loved the house they were leaving. Churchill favored the constitutional arrangement over both sets of domestic preferences. By the time of the coronation, the system had sorted itself into place. Buckingham Palace belonged visibly to Elizabeth II. Clarence House belonged visibly to the Queen Mother. The move ended the residency question. It didn't end the Queen Mother's presence at the center of royal life. Her former home had been the headquarters of the Crown. Her new home became a lasting court of her own. At Clarence House, Prince Philip's former study became the Queen Mother's morning room, and it remained hers until her death in 2002.